more armed conflicts took place in 2023 than in any other year since the end of World War II. That is the shocking finding in this year's Conflict Trends Report, a yearly paper by the Peace Research Institute Oslo using data from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program and examining global conflict trends since 1946. In total, 59 armed conflicts raged around the world last year. So is our world becoming more violent? Or is this a coincidence of overlapping conflicts, some extraordinarily lethal, from artillery warfare in Ukraine to the razing of Gaza? Today, I speak to Siri Rustad, a research director at PRIO and the author of the Conflict Trends Report. We're joined by Gowan, the United Nations Director for the International Crisis Group and an Associate Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I am Arno Siad, and you're listening to PRIO's Peace in a Pod. Richard, Siri, welcome both to this episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Siri, I'd like to start with the main finding of your report, that the number of armed conflicts was higher in 2023 than at any time since World War II. Give us some of the details.
Sure. So in 2023, we had 59 state-based conflicts. That would mean either international conflicts, such as the one between Russia and Ukraine, or civil wars, such as the conflict in Gaza. Most of these conflicts are low intensity, so less than 100 people killed each year. But at least 9 of them were what we call wars, so that means that more than 1,000 people were killed. However, these 59 conflicts occurred in 34 different countries, which means that while the number of conflict goes up, the number of conflict countries have actually gone down compared to 2022. Which means that some countries have more conflicts now than they did last year. And in fact, 50% of the countries had more than one conflict. And as many as 7 countries had more than 3 conflicts at the same time. This means that the landscape of conflicts is more complex and that the number of conflict actors operating in the same area is higher, making it more difficult to solve these conflicts. And even though if we see that the number of conflicts are going up, we see that the number of people killed in conflicts, and now we're looking at both combatants and civilians, is actually decreased from 280,000 in 2022 to 120,000 in 2023. Nonetheless, 2023 was the third most violent year since 1994 in the Rwandan genocide, only surpassed by 2021 and 2022.
Wow. Richard, you're part of the International Crisis Group. Your organization tries to understand what's going on in the world and to offer solutions to policymakers. From your perspective at the ICG, is the world becoming more violent?
Yes, I think that these quantitative findings definitely match what Crisis Group is seeing through our on-the-ground analysis. We should keep in mind that there are some countries where there have been significant reductions in violence, such as Afghanistan or Syria, although obviously in those cases that was due to pretty bad guys winning military victories. But overall, we see violence increasing in many areas, and we also see that the international peacemaking architecture involving organizations such as the United Nations is really struggling right now to resolve wars or even mitigate the impact of conflict through humanitarian aid. There is a real sense that a lot of the systems we set up in the immediate post-Cold War era to deal with violence are stuttering. They're stuttering because of great power divisions. They're stuttering because of a shortage of funds in some cases. And so our vision of the world at the moment is quite bleak, and this data analysis sadly coincides with what we're seeing.
I'll get back to the great power divisions that you mentioned in a minute, Richard. But Siri, in Western media, a lot of attention has been given to the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. According to your research, can you tell us what were the 3 deadliest conflicts in 2023?
Yeah, so not surprisingly, Ukraine was the most deadly conflict, followed by the conflict in Gaza. But we see on the third most violent conflict was the violent clashes in Khartoum in Sudan in the spring of 2023, which is not spoken that much about anymore. But we also see from the data collected for 2024 thus far is that this conflict is also still ongoing and is likely to become one of the deadliest in 2024 as well.
And Siri, you mentioned that battle-related deaths were actually fewer in 2023 compared to the previous years. I believe in part this is due to the conflict in Ethiopia. For our listeners, we're talking about the conflict in the Tigray region. The Tigray People Liberation Front had been seeking greater autonomy and self-determination, and in November 2020, the federal government of Ethiopia launched a military offensive against the separatists, leading to widespread violence, a series of humanitarian crises, and severe famine conditions. Siri, Ethiopia is one of the deadliest conflicts since the Cold War. So can you tell us about the figures you are seeing from that country?
Yeah, absolutely. The data that I'm talking about here, this is an annual update. So when we got the data last year, we expected Ukraine to be the deadliest and most violent conflict in the data, but we were taken by surprise and Ukraine was surpassed by Ethiopia. And it is kind of embarrassing to admit that we as conflict researchers didn't realize this, didn't sort of notice the extreme violence going on in the Tigray region. Now that said, the reason why we didn't know was that journalists were not allowed in. There was an internet shutdown, information didn't get out. There was a few reports by Amnesty, among others. And in the data we had for 2022, 100,000 people were reported killed. And that's shocking in itself. However, when we got the data this year, they had done backdating. So they also coded more people killed for the previous years. And we saw that for 2021 and 2022, almost 300,000 people had been killed in Ethiopia. And to put that into perspective, that is more than the number of people killed in Afghanistan since 1989, and just a little bit less than in Syria for the past 13 years.
Wow, so we got a more accurate picture of what was actually going on the ground. But Richard, there was a ceasefire between the Ethiopian federal government and Tigrayan authorities at the end of 2022, which explains perhaps the fewer deaths there last year. But we continue to see reports of human rights abuses, summary killings, sexual violence, abductions. What can you tell us about where the conflict is at today?
Well, before we get to where it is at today, let me just say that I'm profoundly saddened by these figures, but I am glad that we are now seeing this data come through. Crisis Group was one of the organizations that covered the war in Ethiopia very closely, although in fact our analyst there was expelled as part of the general effort to try and reduce coverage of what was going on. We had a very strong sense from what we were hearing throughout the war that the death rate was far, far higher than initial estimates were suggesting. And it is tragically the case that the figures you're presenting now confirm our initial suspicions. I do think it's very important that we try and get these figures right, because there is a risk right now that we focus solely on Gaza. Understandably, we focus solely on Ukraine, and we ignore the two huge conflicts we've seen in the Horn of Africa, in Ethiopia and Sudan. And I think there's a moral reason that we should really focus on those wars too, because they have been so appalling. When you look at Ethiopia now, what we analyze is that there is still incremental progress towards implementing the peace deal between the government and the Tigrayan faction. But the problem is that there is now a lot of violence involving other groups in Ethiopia, other regions, Amhara, Oromia. And there's violence between different non-state groups. There are violence between militias and the government. And this could go on for some time. Another of these very fragmented conflicts with multiple actors that are very hard to really resolve sustainably, even if the initial battle with the Tigrayan front has largely ended.
Right, and you mentioned great power competition earlier, Richard. And in your role, you work closely with diplomats and delegations at the UN. And in fact, you've written on the UN Security Council and the dynamics there. And we've seen the Security Council terribly deadlocked on Gaza, Ukraine, etc. Are we entering a new era of great power competition? And what impact might that have on conflicts?
Well, we clearly are now in an era of great power competition, and that clearly is impacting the Security Council. And I would say that over the last 3 or 4 years, In my role on behalf of Crisis Group in New York, I've worked primarily on 5 cases: Myanmar, Ethiopia, Sudan, Gaza, and Ukraine. And in different ways, the Security Council has failed to deal meaningfully with any of those wars. And in many cases, that is because of great power interests and great power tension. China effectively blocks any serious UN engagement on Myanmar. The US blocks the engagement we need on Gaza, and obviously Russia vetoes any resolutions regarding Ukraine. There are still other places where the Council can come to agreement and the UN can do some good. And that would include, for example, peacekeeping in South Sudan or mediation in Yemen. But the political space for the UN is shrinking. And the really big wars that Siri has touched upon are all really cases where the UN does not have the entry points it needs to make peace. We don't know where the floor is. We don't know if this deterioration of major power relations is going to continue to worsen and further reduce the space for the UN, or whether maybe we'll enter a new normal where the UN bumps along, continuing to deal with a few cases such as South Sudan or Cyprus more or less effectively, but still struggles to deal with a lot of first-order crises.
Siri, if we take a step back and look at things not just in the last couple years, but measured in decades, we see that the human cost of war has escalated alarmingly. According to your data, in the past decade alone, over 1 million lives have been lost to conflict. That's an increase from 300,000 in the previous decade. It does seem, according to data, that the world is indeed becoming a lot deadlier overall, isn't it?
Yeah, no, certainly it does. And that's a very worrisome increase. High numbers of battle deaths are usually driven by a few very serious conflicts. It's not like there has been an increase in all of the conflicts. Previously, we have seen these really violent conflicts coming up maybe every 6-7 years. So we get a little spike in the data. But what has happened for the past, let's say, decade, maybe a little bit less, is that we have had a number of these extreme conflicts at the same time. So we got Syria, then we got Yemen, we got Afghanistan with American troops leaving. We got now Ukraine, we got Gaza and Ethiopia. So they are overlapping and all at the same time. Now, it's such a short period that it's hard to say whether this is a trend or if it is a coincidence. Time will show. But I think Richard is making a very good point that the great power competition is hardening. And while these conflicts do not initially have anything to do with each other, they're not driving each other in a way. I mean, there's a competition among conflict countries for the attention. Hence, Ethiopia is losing that battle. And it's also a competition among the powers to position themselves within the conflict landscape, which doesn't promise well for the future.
Richard, given what Siri and her report are highlighting, I want to ask you about democracy. We are witnessing a rollback of democratic rights and institutions across the world, from Eastern Europe to South Asia. The VDEM Institute, based in Sweden, just released their democracy report, which looks at the state of democracy around the globe. And it says that the level of democracy the average person experiences today has regressed to what it was in the 1980s. My question is there any correlation between the backsliding of democracy in the world and this increase in conflicts and death we are seeing?
We're very wary to draw very strong connections between these two trends. But I think it is worth saying that if you look at some of the wars we're talking about, they are associated with failed transitions to civilian rule. So in Sudan, for example, you saw the fall of a long-time autocrat, Omar al-Bashir, in 2019. There was then a painstaking effort to try to get the country towards civilian rule. But even though there did seem to be some progress in that direction, the army and other armed groups sort of plunged into conflict instead. Similarly, in a case like Yemen, you had a sort of a democratic transition that 10 years ago seemed to be making some progress, but then fell apart. And I think that what we can see in many cases is that countries that are making tentative, slow progress towards civilian rule and towards democratic rule are still very, very vulnerable to breaking down into conflict. And there are often armed actors including national militaries in these countries that don't really want to see progress towards democratic rule succeed, and they are willing to use force to maintain their grip over power. Now, I think it is also worth saying that there are some analysts who I think get too nervous and sort of see every election in a fragile state as risky. And, we have actually seen some big democracies like Nigeria go through elections recently that were broadly successful. But there is definitely a correlation between political transition and violence in many of the cases that we're talking about today.
Siri, where are most of these 59 armed conflicts you mentioned in your report located? And by the same token, which areas of the world are stable relatively and do not see conflict? I'd be curious to hear why that is, in your opinion.
So most of the conflicts are in Africa. And there has been an increase of conflicts in Africa over the past decade. But these are smaller conflicts. With the exception of Ethiopia and Sudan, most of them are low-level intensity. So the larger conflicts have been in the Middle East, but also, as Richard mentioned, there has been fewer people killed in, for example, Syria and Yemen and Afghanistan in the past year. So if we don't count Gaza, the Middle East is actually becoming more peaceful, but not in a positive peace way. It's still very difficult to live in that region. But another region which has seen more peace is Southeast Asia. This is the region where had the largest conflicts in the 60s and 70s with the Vietnam War and the Korean Wars. And we haven't seen those type of conflicts in that region lately. We had the end of the war in Sri Lanka, which was brutal. And we, of course, have the Myanmar conflict now. But other than that, this has been a relatively stable region. However, we know there are tensions, and we can just look at Taiwan to see that something is brewing. We also have the Latin America region, which do not have a lot of what we call state-based conflicts. It's Colombia, but has a lot of homicide, one-sided violence, and these non-state conflicts, which are between non-state actors.
And Richard, which areas of the world are stable and do not see conflict? And can you perhaps give us some of your insights as to why?
I think, as Siri was saying, there are variations between the sorts of violence that different regions experience. But it is really worth noting that in somewhere like Central America, you don't have interstate wars, you don't even have classical civil wars, but you have very high levels of violence. So different regions experience instability, but they experience it in different ways. And it's very important that both in analytical research like that of Crisis Group, but also in the data research that we're discussing, that we sort of identify these different forms of instability. I think what is interesting is where we see countries that are making a conscious effort to pull out of conflict. I think Colombia is a fascinating example where the government is currently sort of really working on forging peace with a wide range of armed groups. And we can also see that there are countries in Africa where you have governments that are working to ease the tensions, to ease the small conflicts that we're talking about. But the problem is that you can also have exogenous shocks. We are concerned about how countries' debt loads, how countries' poor economic performance could feed into future cycles of violence. And even where you have governments that are quite committed to reducing violence, financial issues or external tensions related to big power competitions could create escalatory dynamics quite quickly.
Right. I want to end on a more positive note, perhaps, and ask you both the same question. Are you optimistic that those trends are going to reverse? And why should we be optimistic at all, given the state of the world? I'll go to Siri first.
So, after describing all of this data, it's kind of hard to be optimistic, but we can also, looking at this in a historical perspective. And as I mentioned, the 1960s and 1970s were a much more brutal period than we see now. Much more people were killed in conflicts. And these conflicts ended, and this is a stable region now. So I think there's hope, but maybe not in the immediate future.
Yeah, optimism is in slightly short supply in our business right at present. And I think there is a lot of concern that you could see a further shock to the international system, such as a conflict over Taiwan that would be bloody in its own right, but would actually further undermine what is left of international cooperation. And that would have quite severe knock-on effects for conflicts in many regions, because the major power contest we're seeing today would intensify in many theatres. I do think that we must hope that having got to the edge and having got into a very, very dangerous situation, the big powers will recognize that they have a mutual interest, not only in reducing their own tensions, but also in tamping down some of these local crises, which claim many lives and could in some cases escalate and create higher level instability. But we simply don't know whether that's something that could happen in the coming years or may only happen after an extended period of conflict and uncertainty.
Richard, Siri, thank you both. This episode was produced by Arno Siad and edited by Brage Pedersen. PRIO's Peace in a Pod will return for a new season in August. In the meantime, check our previous episodes, policy briefs, events recording, and other research at PRIO.org.